Hello, my people. Welcome back. You just conquered the Unit 3 Sensation and Perception test, so congratulations. And now we are moving on to learning. How do we learn? And our two big celebrities of this chapter is classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. And so this will be the first part 1 of the video lecture this week, and then next week we'll do part 2. So let's buckle in and let's take some really good notes because this is a big, important chapter for the AP test, okay? All right, so please title this learning, and then we will get started. So first, what the heck is learning, right? It is, according to our psychology textbook, it's a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. So the really big key word you should know is that relatively permanent change due to experience. So again, experience is key because everything that we've learned is due to experience, right? When we're out of the womb, we don't know how to hold a bottle, right? Hold a little milk bottle. We don't know how to walk yet. We don't know how to do many things, right? But learning is, again, our changes as we learn things due to our experience, right? So again, learning is a relatively permanent change due to experience. Okay, and due to experience, this dog is thinking about a bone, right? So the realm of so operant and classical conditioning fall under a certain type of learning, and it's called associative learning. And I'll get my little box out of the way so you guys can see the definition. This is where we're linking two events that occur close together in time. Okay, so associative learning is when we link two events that occur closely together in time. So operant and classical conditioning are two types of associative learning, but they are just done in two different ways. And it's really important to know the difference of both, okay? All right. Dun, 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 dun. So what the heck is conditioning, right? And there should be thunder coming around. So hopefully my little slide will do the little thunder. So conditioning is the process of learning. It's our process of learning associations between events and the behavioral response. So there's a stimulus 1 with a connection to another stimulus. And the perfect example is seeing lightning is the first stimulus, and we are already anticipating hearing thunder because these two stimuli occur close together in time, right? So again, classical conditioning is where we learn to associate two events, right? Two events similar in time. And after repetition of seeing stimulus 1 with the lightning, our response is going to start to associate with what we know that comes next, which is thunder. So we cover our ears to avoid the sound. So classical conditioning is where we, over repetition, we start to associate two stimuli together. And again, the main example is we see lightning, we're ready to hear thunder, right? So some kids will do this right away, right? Because we associate the two together, right? So two stimuli over repeated times will slowly start to have our brains connect the two stimuli as being together, okay? So the two stimuli that are associated together, okay? All right. And operant conditioning. So operant conditioning will be in our next video module. So I just wanted you to see the difference before this lecture will be all about classical conditioning, but it's still good to know about our next little lecture in the next video lecture slide or the PowerPoint slide because it's important to know what you're comparing it to. So we had classical, which is where you have two stimuli associated together, right, over repeating times. It's almost like it starts to become involuntary, right? Operant conditioning is where we associate a response key, so we associate a behavior and its consequences. So if you've ever trained a dog, if you've ever had to teach your little siblings to be potty trained, we have all been classically and operantly conditioned in some aspect of life. We've all been potty trained. So, I mean, that is a perfect example of operant conditioning. So it's where we associate the behavior with its consequences. So this one is voluntary, while classical conditioning is, it happens, we associate two stimuli involuntarily. We just quickly cover our ears. This is operant conditioning is voluntary, and it's the reward response. Okay, so think training pets if you want to put a little blurb. So this is where we learn to repeat behaviors followed by desirable results. So the seal knows that, okay, if I put this ball on my nose, this human is going to give me a fish as the result. So I do this behavior and I get a reward. So think of operant conditioning as the reward system. Okay, it's the reward system. If you've ever had any little children running around, you know exactly what the reward system does. And this is where they learn to avoid behaviors that are undesirable, right? So for example, back in the days when, spanking was, I wouldn't say more acceptable, but, just more commonly done. So for example, my brother, right? He ran into the street one day chasing after a ball. My dad was so mad because he almost got hit by a car that my dad went inside and spanked my brother, right? You bet your butt he did not run into that street ever again, because what he learned is that behavior was associated with an undesirable result. You do not want it to happen again, right? So it's going to slowly stop the behaviors from happening again, right? So maybe it'll happen less often, right? So again, operant conditioning is the reward system of behavior with its consequences, okay? While classical conditioning is where we associate two stimuli together involuntarily, since over time we get conditioned by it, okay? And we'll go more into detail, don't worry. Okay, so operant conditioning will be in the next video lecture, okay? All right, so classical conditioning versus operant conditioning, and these were two really great examples in your textbook, so I just took screenshots and just so you can kind of get a visual of how they're different. So classical conditioning, right, we have stimuli 1, which is lightning, stimuli number 2, which is thunder, right? So lightning and then boom. And our response is a startled reaction, right? So the first time it happens, so usually when you're a kid, or if you have dogs that hate thunder, they have no idea what's going on, right? They have a startled reaction. But after repetition over time, right? Repetition over time, we will start to associate lightning and when we already are anticipating thunder. So we may already cup our ears, we may not even respond to it because we have been conditioned to associate lightning with thunder, right? So it's almost involuntary. It happens, and it's like it's a innate response. It's a learned response, right? And where operant conditioning, which is in our lower little section right here, right? And of course, it has to involve a kid getting a cookie. So first, we have the response. We have the action or behavior saying, "Please, can I have a cookie?" And it says consequence, but you can also think of what's the response. The behavioral response is getting a treat. So your behavior is strengthened. So if your kid comes up and says, "May I have a cookie?" and they get one, you bet your butt they're going to do that more often, right? So little kids are totally, we feed them with treats, right? We try to make them do everything. And so usually, for example, if we were in real life classroom right now, I usually give candy at the end of each test. And in this chapter, everyone starts calling me out because I'm trying to I'm trying to condition you to expect rewards on test day so you're a little happier. So after a while, if I forget to hand out candy, students are like, "Wait, Ms. H, we did our test. Where's our candy?" Because they're so used, because the behavior is strengthened, right? And so again, think for operant conditioning, it's reward-based. And for classical conditioning, it's an involuntary response over repeated repetition over time, okay? Because remember, this kid is choosing to ask for a cookie, right? And when we dive into classical conditioning, you can see how it's a little bit more involuntary, okay? All right, perfect. Moving on. So before we get started, remember we have to talk about our lenses. I told you that we would have our behavioral lens on very quickly, and it's in Unit 4. So this is our learning behavioral, this is the behavioral psychologist's dream. Because remember, behavioralists love to observe what they are seeing. They love to observe what they are seeing, okay? And so behaviorism in this view of psychology is that they think it should be an objective science, study behaviors without taking in the mental account, right? We don't think about our cognitive, we don't think about our brain. But our main behavioralists observe and record. And so classical and operant conditioning, you can observe and record, right? And so these are our three main behavioralists that you will need to know their names. So we do have, Ivan Pavlov is our celebrity of this video lecture. He is the one who created classical conditioning. And then B.F. Skinner, he'll be in our next video lecture because he's the one who came up with operant conditioning, or founded operant conditioning, right? And Watson, you will hang to, he will be next week, and he did some experiments that are a little controversial, okay? But these are our three main behavioralists. And so we do need to go into a little bit about Ivan. So Pavlov is, he is one of the more famous psychologists, and he is known for his experiments with saliva when it comes to dogs. I know you're like, whoa, what? But let's learn a little bit about Ivan Pavlov before, because remember, psychology really wasn't around, right? And so Pavlov actually stumbled into classical conditioning. He wasn't even meant to be studying that, which is so interesting. So Pavlov believed that experimental investigation should lay solid foundation for true science with psychology, and so he actually started off as studying physiology, right? Physiology, sorry. And he was interested about how our inner workings of our system work within our body. So he studied the digestive system for 2 decades. He wasn't even a psychologist, but psychologists weren't around, right? And he won the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1904, and he accidentally discovered classical conditioning through his work with the salivation. So with dogs, so he worked with dogs' saliva and their salivation reflex, and he realized with constant conditioning of 2 stimuli, conditioned responses are formed, which is where the lingo, this is where we're going to learn our lingo. So he just stumbled across it. So what we're going to do is, I want you to pause the video lecture, and in your video lecture PowerPoint slide, you are going to watch this video. I linked it, and it's about how Pavlov found out about classical conditioning. So pause me now, waiting to be paused, and then come back to me after you watch the video, okay? And I'm gonna now review it. So pause, watch the video, and let's get started again. Okay, so I'm assuming you watched Pavlov and his little fluffy dogs. They're so cute. And let's learn about the video review. And this is where we're going to learn all the key terms of classical conditioning. So take really good notes on this slide, okay? So first, we have to start with an unconditioned stimulus, okay? And these are all important vocab terms for classical conditioning, so please take really good notes. And we also have abbreviations. So unconditioned stimulus, I call it the US, or that's how I would write it on the board if we were in class. So please know the abbreviations of the words too, okay? So we have the unconditioned stimulus, and every time I say unconditioned, it is unlearned. It is innate, you have not learned it. So essentially, it is a biological response that naturally happens. So an unconditioned stimulus is an unlearned stimulus. You have not classically conditioned it at all. So for example, after you watch the dog video, the stimulus, it's the one that naturally triggers a response. So for example, in the video you just watched, the unconditioned stimulus was the food. Okay, because no matter what, if dogs were to look at food, they start to salivate, and that's natural. It is unlearned, right? So even us, as we eat food, we start to salivate because it biologically starts the digestive process, right? So when we start to salivate, it's our body's natural way that's unlearned. We did not teach ourselves to salivate when we, start to eat food. It's a natural response, okay, or a natural stimulus, okay? So unconditioned stimuluses are unlearned. Okay, unlearned. And just like I said, the unconditioned response, unlearned. It's an unlearned response. So again, it's innate. So in the video, the unconditioned stimulus was the food, and the naturally occurring result of a dog looking at food is they start to salivate, right? They start to drool and they get very excited, and that's the unconditioned response. So Pavlov, you can grab your dogs right now, and if you give them a piece of food, they're gonna start to salivate, right? So if you have a dog that stares at you while you eat and they start to drool, my dogs create like long drool icicles. It's a natural response, right? It's because they're getting ready to, their digestion's revved up to see if you'll give them a treat, right? Now this is where we start classical conditioning. It starts with the neutral stimulus. So this is what Pavlov discovered, the neutral stimulus. And this is the key to classical conditioning. So we have our natural stimulus and our natural response. Now we're going to add a learned object into the situation. So you can grab any neutral stimulus. It's a stimulus that has not been paired with any unconditioned stimulus, and it elicits no responses. So in the beginning, when Pavlov started to play the bell, when they started to eat the food, because that's when the salivation would be happening, the bell had nothing to do with it. He just started to associate the bell with it. So this is where classical conditioning starts, is at the neutral stimulus. So please write that in your notes, okay? So the NS, the neutral stimulus. So if I started, so it could be a bell, it could be me clapping my hands, right? It's anything that's not a part of the the innate reaction. So our neutral stimulus is a bell. So Pavlov started to, every time it was almost dinner time, he would start playing this bell, right? And so as the dogs ate, they knew that the bell happened before they started eating. So over time, remember, because due to repetition, this is what we're going to start to see. It's going to create a conditioned stimulus. So remember, unconditioned means unlearned, conditioned means learned. So please, in your notes, write learned next to conditioned. So anytime it says conditioned in front of it, it has been learned, okay? So the conditioned stimulus is a previously natural stimulus, which is the neutral stimulus. So I'm going to give you a quick hint. The neutral stimulus always turns into the conditioned stimulus after repetition, okay? So the bell in the beginning is the neutral stimulus because it doesn't give any responses. But once the bell starts to stimulate a learned response, it turns into the conditioned stimulus. So again, so we paired the bell with the unconditioned stimulus, right? Which is just them waiting for the food, right? And it triggers a conditioned response. So right now, the bell is, because right when the dogs start to salivate, when the bell is only playing, they are showing that they're getting a conditioned response because their drool is triggered now, not by the food, but by the bell. Okay? So it's not the food anymore. It's no longer a natural process. The bell is triggering the saliva before they even see the food, right? Because over time, the dog starts to associate, this is when food happens, right? And then the body is now learned response to start salivating, okay? And then that leads to the conditioned response, which is a learned response, okay? So after the dogs start to associate the bell, a learned response now is that their conditioned response is to salivate because the conditioned stimulus is now the bell, okay? So it's no longer the food. The food was taken out of the equation. If Pavlov just rang the bell, dogs would start to salivate. Let me give you another situation. I had a friend's dog that if anyone was in the kitchen, the dog was conditioned to sit by the door of the kitchen, and he would start to drool. He wouldn't even see any food, but if people were moving around in the kitchen, that was the conditioned stimulus that he learned, because he started to learn that the conditioned response might be food in the end, right? So this is how dogs or pets start to associate certain behaviors in your house, right? So again, the conditioned stimulus is now the bell, because the bell is eliciting the conditioned response, which is this salivation to the saliva. We no longer need the food, right? So the unconditioned stimulus is no longer there. And let me show you what it looks like in a visual lens, okay? So first, before conditioning, no response. We could ring the bell, right? The neutral stimulus is not doing anything to the dog, right? It's a neutral stimulus. It's neutral. It's not doing any responses, right? And this is still before conditioning. Unconditioned stimulus, food, created the unconditioned response of the dog salivating. Okay, so unconditioned stimulus, food. If the dog sees food, starts to salivate. Totally natural. This is all unlearned. Okay, we have not taught the dog anything. Now, during conditioning, you're going to repeat this action over time, where with the bell and seeing the food, the dog starts to salivate. the dog is going to salivate. So the dog is going to slowly start to associate the bell with food, right? So now the bell and the food makes the dog salivate. Okay, so this is during conditioning. So this is over repetition. After the dog is conditioned, all you have to do is ring the bell of the conditioned stimulus, because now it's conditioned, right? The bell is now turned in from the neutral stimulus to the conditioned stimulus. And now if you ring the bell, the dog will be conditioned response to salivate. How cool is that, right? And so now we took out the unconditioned stimulus completely. We took out the middleman. And this is how we can start condition animals, humans. This works for anyone who can learn, right? It's learning. So again, hopefully those visuals helped. And just a few more vocab, okay? A few more vocab. So acquisition is the initial learning of the stimulus-response relationship. So you are acquiring your learned response, right? So over time, the more that you practice your conditioning with your, let's say the dog, the stronger the salivation reflex strengthens, right? So if you do this with your dog every day with the bell, it's going to be they're going to pick it up quick, right? And so the longer that you repeat it and do this conditioning, the stronger their relationship with the conditioned response and the conditioned stimuli and the conditioned response. So again, acquisition. Over time, the longer you condition, the stronger the relationship of the conditioned response, right? So if you only did this with your dog for like a month, they'll slowly, it's not as strong, right? But if they did it for their whole life, oh yeah. So as the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned response are paired more often, the conditioned response becomes stronger, right? All right. And this was in your book. So an example of acquisition, right? It's kind of silly. So you give your partner a kiss. So your unconditioned stimulus is like, oh, so innately, right, biologically, kissing is a sign of affection, right? So the kiss is a natural. They're not being conditioned. And then the unconditioned response is arousal, right? So this is all biologically happening in your body naturally. But let's add in onion breath to our kiss, and there's still arousal, right? So we're connecting the neutral stimulus, right, of the onion breath. So this technically, while in the conditioning phase, this would be a neutral stimulus, right? With the unconditioned stimulus, causes arousal, but over time, it will turn into the conditioned stimulus as being onion breath, and you will have arousal. So I know it's a silly concept, but if you've ever had like food remind you of like someone you know, you have been conditioned to associate. So for example, my grandma always makes peanut butter cookies in the winter. And every time I see a peanut butter cookie, I think of her. And so I have been conditioned, right? And so sometimes I even call her after I see cookies. It is a response that I innately over time strengthened, right? And I had no idea. So this is an example of acquisition. And just like we can acquire something, they can also go extinct. And I know it's like very crazy, like dinosaurs go extinct, right? But if the conditioned response, so if you no longer practice with the conditioned stimulus, it will slowly start to go away. So if you stop the behavior of ringing the bell with the food, the dog will slowly start to not respond to it anymore, right? Because it's going extinct. If you don't practice your conditioning, right? Just like in sports or anything else, right? We start to lose it, right? So we start to lose it. So extinction, it can go away over time, and that is called extinction. But because we're crazy human beings, we can also spontaneously recover, right? So the reappearance of a weakened CR after a pause, it's just that the extinction suppresses the conditioned response rather than extinguishes it. So maybe it just lowers it subtly, right? But maybe it's not completely all gone, but it can spontaneously come back. So people have shown that, maybe Pavlov's dogs, after a few months, there'll be a bell and they'll start to salivate. So it can come back. It can come back, okay? So we do have generalization. Oops, let me go back. There you go. So we have generalization, and generalization is once a response has been conditioned, the tendency to respond in similar ways to the stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. So, for example, in layperson terms, if you use a bell with the dogs might start to associate the bell with ringing a doorbell, and they'll do the same response. So if Pavlov's dog started to generalize the sound of the bell, if they heard the doorbell, they would also salivate because they're generalizing it. They're grouping them all together, right? They're grouping the sounds together. So if you've ever heard of so my dogs get excited, or my parents' dogs get excited when they hear the bag of the doggy food open, but they also get excited when they hear a bag of chips open, right? Because they started to connect the similar sounds to the same response, right? So that's when you generalize. But on the other hand, we can discriminate, right? So the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other similar stimuli that do not signal the unconditioned stimulus. So for example, some dogs will not respond to the doorbell because it's not the same as the bell, right? They can discriminate, they can tell the difference. And another example is that infants can tell the difference between their mother's voice versus other voices of other women. Like, how cool is that, right? So they are able to separate, right? They are able to separate the sound. So if Pavlov's dogs were discriminating, they were able to discriminate sounds, they would not respond to a microwave beep the same way as a bell, right? But if they did, they would be generalizing the sounds, okay? All right. Again, we do have some biological predispositions when we think of learning. John Garcia, you might want to know it. I would highlight his name. He challenged the idea that all associations can be learned equally well. Okay, so humans and animals are biologically predisposed to learn certain associations, but not others, probably to increase chances of survival. So for example, feeling nauseous at the sight of red berries after eating them once they have made you sick before. So if anyone's so for example, I got a really bad stomach flu in high school, and I threw up Chipotle and other things, but I wasn't able to eat Chipotle for at least 2 years after, because I would associate puking with the smell of the food, right? Because we are able to associate, right? So I associate stimuli 1, Chipotle, with stimuli number 2, which is puking, right? So, we do have predispositions, and it's also a survival skill. So if we know something makes us sick, we're going to avoid it next time, right? So this is kind of a real world example of John Garcia really challenging how associations work with humans, right? So if anyone's ever puked something up and you can't eat it anymore, it's happened to you. And just before we wrap up our first lecture, or video lecture, we do have the biopsychosocial approach. So I do want you guys to write down 1 bullet point per box. So for biological influences, of course, that there's genetic predispositions. Obviously, we can't make a fish climb a tree, right? So we have biological constraints. We can't make, a monkey fly, right? So there is biological constraints. We can't do everything because no matter how much we try to learn it, our bodies aren't made for it, right? Psychological influences, so previous experiences, that's a beautiful one to write down. Generalization, discrimination, they all happen with our previous experiences, right? And also a social cultural influence when it comes to learning is our motivation, which is affected by others, our culturally learned preferences, and our learning. So these are the 3 little boxes for our biopsychosocial approach. All right. We don't need to know. Pavlov and Watson, learning results from environmental experiences. And we're almost done. So real quick, Pavlov's legacy. Why is Pavlov's work important? Classical conditioning is a one-way all species can learn to adapt to their environment, okay? All animals, all humans can be classically conditioned. Okay, and it could happen with our environment. It could be for a survival skill if you smell smoke and last time you learned you had to run away, right? For me, I was classically conditioned. It's a little bit kind of similar to PTSD, where if I, after the Tubbs fires in 2017, every time I smelled smoke, my anxiety would start to increase because I would start to go into fight or flight because I associated the stimulus of smelling smoke with get out of town, right? So this happens to all of us without really even realizing it, right? Learning can be studied objectively. It provides a scientific model for the psychological science. There's a lot of data with our learning unit. And another really cool application of classical conditioning, we can look at it from a former drug user's lens, who they used to, where they crave drugs. So what they say is that due to classical conditioning, people who are struggling to stay sober should stay away from the environments that trigger those behaviors, because that is classical conditioning. If you go back to the environment in your friends where you started to use drugs, you have associated that area with drug use. So that's why in these programs of rehabilitation programs, they tell you move to a different city, get new friends, because you don't want to go back to those associations. So so again, former drug users crave the drug when they're in the environment which they took them, and they associate the people with whom they took the drugs with. Okay, and so this is kind of a bigger picture with how classical conditioning can be very powerful. Okay. Oh gosh, this picture is so gross. I bring it up every time because I hate spiders. But anyway, applications for classical conditioning. There is the extinction process, right? Or we can newly condition to help unwanted responses to stimuli. This can also be used as a therapy to get over, a lot of people use classical conditioning to get over heights slowly, right? And it's called exposure therapy, where we try to systematically desensitize, right, to come back the conditioned response that you have created with that stimuli. So for example, if you're deathly afraid of elevators, or, I'm trying to think of anything random, right? But there is a way to slowly start to expose yourself to get those conditioned responses to change, okay? All right, okay, so I'm going to tell you about the little Albert experiment, and then after I talk about the slide, you are going to go on your video lecture slide and watch the little Albert video, and then do the answer for the activity there, and then come back, okay? And then we'll debrief. So John Watson is known for the little Albert experiment. So again, I want you to kind of come up with a way to remember John Watson's name, and he is little Albert, okay? And he applied the principles of classical conditioning to humans, right? So Pavlov came out with this classical conditioning for animals, and of course, our society wants to see, well, does it work on humans? And so Watson believed that human emotions and behaviors are merely a bundle of conditioned responses, right? And so John Watson did an experiment with a child named little Albert. So now please pause the video and watch the video on little Albert. All right, so welcome back from the little Albert video. I'm wondering what your thoughts are. I wish I was in class to have you share your thoughts, but it's okay. So let's see what happened to little Albert, right? So before conditioning, the neutral stimulus, right, so before conditioning, Albert loved little white fuzzy animals, right? He loved rats. He liked to pet them, and this could be associated with any other animal, right? So little Albert, when he was hanging out with the animals, he had no fear, right? So again, it was an innate response. You see a cute animal, you want to pet it, right? So now let's talk about, so before conditioning, the neutral stimulus, the rat, there was no fear. The conditioned response was to pet, to be happy, right? Or sorry, the response was to pet or be happy, right? Then we added in the neutral stimulus, which is the clanging of the metal, okay? And that would scare little Albert, right? So the unconditioned stimulus of the steel bar hitting with a hammer, right? His natural response was fear, right? So this unconditioned stimulus of just hitting a random little bar, right? Nothing to do with animals, it made him fearful, right? Made him fearful. And now we can start to see where this is going, right? So his natural responses to a rat, he loves them. Natural response to a loud clanging, fear, right? Let's see what happens for next, right? So when we started to connect the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus of hitting a steel bar, little Albert started to associate the loud clanging of the bar with the rat's presence, and that would start to elicit fear. So now, with the rat and the clanging together, Albert is getting fearful, and this is during conditioning. And remember, this is going to be repeated over and over again. and let's see what the results are. The rat, so the neutral stimulus turns into the conditioned stimulus, which is the rat. So just by the mere presence of the rat, little Albert was fearful. So we were able to condition a baby to be fearful of something. Interesting, right? And so over time, there's little study. There's mixed reviews of what really actually happened to little Albert after this experiment, but I don't think he liked any, and he started to generalize, so he didn't like any white fuzzy animal. Could be a cat, could be a dog. He was fearful, right? And so that led me to my activity question of, do you think that this is child abuse, right? So anyway, but this is how it works in real life, right? And so that's why Watson was so prominent in the psychology field, because he did his little Albert experiment, which probably can't be done today for many reasons. So anyway, it's so cool to see what we can do with conditioning, right? So that is the end of our first video lecture, and finish up the activities, and I'll see you for the next video on operant conditioning.